I am Laverne McCartney Knighton. I am a 35-year resident of the Twin Cities. I live here in St. Paul in District 65 and very passionate about my community. I live in a neighborhood that was part of Rondo. So the history there of Rondo being somewhat disrupted and destroyed due to the 94 freeway being built. So I've seen this community transition and change and evolve and become and become all that it can be. And of course, there's so much more that it can be. But in 2020, I ran for state senator in this district against 30 plus year incumbent. And as we all know, 2020 was a pivotal year, timing after George Floyd's murder, and so many Black women rose up that year to really make a difference. I was asked to run. That wasn't something I had planned, but it seemed so right for such a time as that. My motivation became very clear that I was running for change, running for eradicating the status quo. You don't get to ask any woman of color to wait anymore. We waited long enough. So basically, I jumped into the race after early voting had already begun. I entered the race early June. So I was running to place in the primary. So I had less than 2 months to fully launch a campaign, which I did and was very successful at that. And in 2 months' time, raised more than $30,000, was able to garner 36% of the vote. And as Devonna said, I felt like that was a pretty successful run for such a short time. Very proud of what I was able to build with my campaign team. I believe we should have elected representation and elected officials who represent the communities they serve. I am currently area director for United Negro College Fund, where we put scholarships in students' hands. So I was doing that campaign alongside with still keeping my job. So basically, it was a great opportunity that I couldn't have passed up. And I know now that if the opportunity presents itself again, I would devote full time to it. And I wasn't quite ready to do that in this election year. So
my name is Nadia Mohamed. I am a Somali American, and I'm also a Muslim American who immigrated here to America when I was like 10 years old. But so I have lived in St. Louis Park since the day I came to America, and it's been my home. It's been the only home I've known, right? And growing up there, I live in a very predominantly white, affluent, if not upper middle class. And so it was highly segregated in the way that we've interacted socially, economically, housing wise, everything. You could just tell what neighborhood you were in, depending on where you're at in the city, right? And because we're a suburb, there's always been this belief that, we're good to go. Like, we're a first ring suburb, we don't need any resources. We don't need anything. We're good to go. And that's how the council members or the lawmakers or the decision makers in the city mostly operated when I was growing up, right? And so as soon as I finished high school, I started getting into community advocacy, letting people know, like, hey, we're here. The most growing population in the suburbs are people who are getting old, right? Senior citizens and people of color moving out into the suburbs. And so it's quite unfair for us not to be heard, not to be listened, and not to be at the table. And so in part of that community advocacy, we would hold like discussions, neighborhood discussions. We would talk about, like, what people are experiencing. How can we change that experience for a positive one? And how can we make it into part of our policies, a part of our decision making? And a lot of that work all throughout college, it was very much reliant on the council members hearing our voices and then making those decisions based on that, and not necessarily anybody at the table. And so a year before finishing my college studies at the age of 22, I decided to run for office. It wasn't an easy one, but I think Miss Laverne was kind of touching up on, is Black women are now realizing it's time, right? Like we are not waiting for anybody else. So there's this, like, even studies that show that women have to be asked 7 times before before they even run, right? So imagine women of color, how many times did they have to be asked to run for them to actually consider it? So I did run. I was like, you know what? The worst thing they can say is no, and then I'll just go to my corner. It's fine. We'll come back for a bigger fight. And so, but eventually I did win, and I became the youngest elected city council member in the city, as well as the first Black woman elected into that seat, the first Muslim woman elected into that seat, and the first Somali American elected into that seat. So when I say representation absolutely matters, and looking like the people that you're serving absolutely matters. For a while, I was the only person of color and the only renter and the only person who's experienced low income housing. And now we're getting a little bit more voices. We have another woman of color who's joined. And the conversation is no longer just one-sided. It's multiple stories being told, and that being I guess those stories becoming part of the decision making.
I am Sharon Brooks Green, and I'm running for school board director in Robbinsdale Area School District 281. I currently serve on the board and have been since last November, when I was appointed unanimously by our board when Pam Lindbergh stepped down. There was a vacancy and quite a few community members applied. I did at the last minute for different reasons. I almost did not apply, but what I was thinking was, if not me, then who and with what values? Because I know my values that I bring to the table are pure. I'm thinking overall, all of our children. We have some 11 to 12,000 children in our district. And I'm sitting here with a master's degree in advocacy and political leadership, and I'm currently a doctoral candidate for public policy and administration. I'm a Rotarian with the Crystal New Hope Robbinsdale group, just doing a lot of work towards policy and giving. And with these credentials, and knowing that I wasn't fully using them and this position became available, if not me, then who, with what values? And so it's been really good being on the board and being part of that decision making on what happens to our children in policy and governance through our superintendent, who's my only employee. As a board member, as a board collectively, we're his only boss. And that's not said arrogantly, but with much responsibility for these children in the 7 cities that we serve. Except for our chair, we still have she was the only Black on the board in the past 100 years, and that's Helen Bassett. So now she's been serving for 20 years, and until I came along, she was the only Black. So now I'm the second Black in history on this board. And what it does give representation to the majority of our students, because we now are 60% people of color with about 25% Black and then other races of color. We are, and I do represent that. It's still the overarching representation for all of our students. And I love to hear from parents, and I love to hear from the community about what our schools should look like. I think that we have more in common than we don't. The last piece about me is my heart is for families of the imprisoned. I started a nonprofit organization called Peace of Hope back in 2012 and supported families of the imprisoned. It started off primarily volunteering, and then we connected with the Department of Corrections, had some contracts there, and serving those families who also aren't, I would say, given access to the voting procedures. So all the way around, it's all about voting for candidates that you know, who you respect and share values with. And then, of course, children are our future. And I'm glad to be in this arena where I'm setting policies and governing for the children's best interests.
Well, I am a Puerto Rican born in Minnesota, raised my entire life in District 65B, which is the west side of St. Paul, downtown St. Paul, a little bit of West End now that we have redistricting, and the new city of West St. Paul. I am a youth worker. I direct mentorship programming with the Twin Cities Mobile Jazz Project, a nonprofit that serves youth throughout the Twin Cities and after school programming and in-school program with utilizing music, production, and recording arts as a way to strengthen literacy, as a way to strengthen communication and acceptance in a system. Predominantly our students of color, are Black, African-American and East African, Latinos, Indigenous, what my district looks like, and Asian students that have been here for over 4 generations of family within their communities, and students that have just arrived in refuge. I was brought up in a nonprofit performing arts school that my mother and my aunt founded called El Arco Iris Center for the Arts, which is now known as the Borinquen Cultural Center, utilizing Afro, Latino, and Afro-Caribbean folk and traditional music as a way to build a platform and cultural competency in this state of Minnesota. It is a legacy that I'm proud of, hence which gave me the tools to be the international recording artist that I am. I'm also a small business owner. I own a label called Soda Rico, proud of my dual heritage of being from Minnesota, but also being Boricua of Puerto Rican descent. And I'm a type 1 diabetic since I was 16, since I started recording my first albums. So how I got engaged in politics is I'm a daughter of human rights activists that came out of, the Vietnam War, out of the Lower East Side's Puerto Rican community and the Young Lords movement. Hence, I've got the Young Lords magazine in the background, Palante, and that gave me the ambition to really recognize growing up as a young woman of color in a community, the first barrio here in the state of Minnesota, the west side of St. Paul, and also recognizing the disparities amongst our communities, whether it's through health and education, and also amongst our communities of color. I'm Puerto Rican. I grew up with all the shades of the coffee as my bloodline, and it really touched my heart to see so much racism in a community that it continues, where my daughter is I'm a mother, beautiful Black and brown young girl that's 3 years old. So what amplified me was all of that to get engaged in politics. I've been a part of politics since I was out my mother's womb. She was the first Latina appointed by Rudy Perpich, who was governor back then, for the offices of equal opportunity. She directed the offices of equal opportunity. So this government and politics and policy work has gone from a state level of me being raised in that tundra to being on the streets with the movement of the people. And it's not just about being Latina running, it's about being a woman of color running. Been raised by the works of the first Black and woman mayor of Minneapolis, Sharon Belton. These were the women at our tables, Ramona Rosales, starting education and one of the founders of the Chicano Latino Studies program at the U. So when we talk about village, and it takes a village to raise a child, I'm that child that came out of strong women in village. Robin Hickman, the traditions of the Rondo community. It wasn't just a base of here's one spot and this is what we got to do. Why I'm running for state. Some folks say it's your first run. Why don't you learn a little bit about how the ropes are ran? And I'm like, I know the ropes. It's called fighting white supremacy and fighting sexism and racism. Right. We got to get in there. So that's a little bit about my background on all of those 3 questions that you asked.
When you have many voices at the table, you have much that can be done. I mean, for the world to continue to operate in that silo that only, one voice from a diverse perspective is necessary. We need many voices. And until we as a country can see that, we're not going to move as forward as fast as we should. But, many voices, many different perspectives are just so critical to any decision-making process.